Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Robyn Roscoe. Robyn uses she, her pronouns and is a certified project management professional with nearly 20 years of experience in management of large health research projects and over 30 years of experience in project management in the scientific and technical fields. She's currently the Director of Management and Administration for Canada's Michael Smith Genome Science Project Centre at BC Cancer PHSA, responsible for project finance and operations management, as well as program management for the Personal Oncogenomics program. She previously worked in the oil and gas sector as a project manager, operations specialist, and environmental manager. She holds a BSc from the University of Manitoba, and since 2004, Robyn has been delivering training workshops and presentations throughout Canada, reaching more than 3,000 trainees and professionals looking to develop and expand their management and leadership skills. You can learn more about Robyn and her work on her website, which we'll add a link to in the chat. It's my pleasure to now introduce and pass over the Zoom microphone to Robyn.
Thank you very much, Alexa, and a big thank you to MEOPAR for inviting me to be a part of the annual training meeting today. I'm going to share my screen. There we are. Excellent. So as Alexa said, I'm going to be talking today about the hybrid model of working remotely and lessons learned over the last 18 or 20 months or so. I want to take a moment, first of all, to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from my home office, which is located within the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Musqueam, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsuut'ina nations. And we are all treaty peoples. So greetings to you from the other side of Turtle Island. I won't go through the details of my my background because Alexa's given me a good overview. You will see on this slide some additional contact or connection information for me. If at any time after the session today you have a question or you'd like some additional resources or you'd just like to connect and chat, please feel free to reach out to me at the information shown here. I will be providing an abbreviated version of my slides, including this one, to MEOPAR for distribution to the participants today. Just some ground rules for our work together today. I would encourage you to ask questions at any time during the session, and please use the chat box to do that. We're a pretty small group, but I can only keep a few windows on my screen open at any one time, and I keep the chat box open so I can see if you have a question, I can call on you, or if you'd like to type out your question, then we can address it whenever you like. But please don't save all of your questions up to the end. If you have a question, probably somebody else has something similar they'd like to ask, so you're able to ask it at any time. And because we're going to be touching on some things that might be new or unfamiliar to people, but also might be extremely familiar and perhaps a little vulnerable to people, given the past experiences we've had through the pandemic period, I would just ask everybody to be respectful and thoughtful and kind with your questions and comments today. So we're going to do a quick poll first off to just get a sense of where people were prior to the pandemic period. So just going to launch this quick poll. So it looks like the majority of people pre-pandemic were working not remotely, so working on site in an office or in a lab, but in a space at an institution. Oh, we have somebody who was a bit of both. Thanks very much for participating in that. Go. So what we're going to go over in the session today, I'm going to start by defining some of the terms that we typically use when we think about hybrid working. We'll have a little bit of a look at what the world was like pre-pandemic, what the pandemic requirements did in terms of restructuring the ways and the places in which we work. And then I'll talk about some of the lessons learned in my experience and where I see the future going when it comes to a hybrid workplace. So first, let's define a couple of things. And the first one I want to define is remote in terms of remote working. Remote can mean a variety of different things. It can mean something that is secluded or out of the way. This is a picture that I took on the ferry through the Inside Passage on the coast of British Columbia. This is a very remote spot that you can't get to without some significant planning and boats in order to get to that location. We can also have remote as meaning small in degree. So the remote chance or the remote likelihood that something is going to happen, like the remote chance that you might win the lottery. Oops. We can also think about remote as being distant in manner. So people who are aloof are sometimes considered to be remote in terms of their manner or their interactions with other people. And remote can also mean the remote. Has anybody seen the remote? I can't find the remote is usually how we refer to this. And it's a device that we use for controlling something from a distance. For our purposes, we're thinking about remote as being doing something from a distance, and in particular, working from a distance from the place where we would normally be working or where we were previously working, where our work prior to the pandemic typically took place. This doesn't include field work, which of course, by definition, has to be away from the place where we're employed or where we conduct the majority of our work. When we think about a hybrid, when it comes to work, there's a couple of different ways that we can think about or define hybrid. Hybrid can mean something that is heterogeneous in origin. So we might have a hybrid tulip, like we see in this picture, a hybrid rose, a hybrid animal, something that has been blended or made from two other things. We can also have a blend of cultures. So we can have classic rock, we can have jazz fusion, we can have a blend of different cultures that make something new, and we would consider that to be a hybrid. We can also think about a hybrid vehicle, something that uses multiple types of fuel sources. So it's, again, a blend of two different things. And so when it comes to working, we are thinking about a combination or blend of two distinct elements or characteristics. And in the case of working, we're talking about a blend of on-site and remote. But there's also different ways that we can think about hybrid as it applies to individuals and as it applies to workplaces or workforces. So thinking about this in the context of work, we have on-site, which is where an individual or a group works at a main or central location of a company or an institution. So working on site at Dalhousie or working on site in the laboratory where your research is taking place. Whereas remote refers to an individual working away from that main site. In other words, not on site. When it comes to hybrid, there's two different ways of looking at this. We have an individual, a hybrid individual, who works both on site and remotely. And so they have a hybrid way of working themselves. And then we can have hybrid when it comes to an organization, which refers to a workforce that includes on-site workers, remote workers, and hybrid workers. And that is what we mean by a hybrid workforce. Not everybody in a hybrid workforce works in a hybrid way. And we need to make sure that we're considering that when we think about how to plan and then work well in a hybrid organization. So prior to the pandemic, as you referred to in the poll, people were working on site for the most part. And part of the perception about remote or hybrid work prior to the pandemic was not looked at as favorable. There were a lot of concerns by employers and employees and coworkers about what that might mean if people were working in a remote way or working in a hybrid way, in a formal and continuous way. And some of the resistance to this was related to the fact that it was rare, and so it was unusual. It was also sometimes seen as a privilege for people to have that kind of setup. And that is true. It was often given, or people were allowed to work in that way because of where they were in the organization, but it wasn't something that was necessarily encouraged or made available to the larger group of employees. It was also not well supported by organizations and groups, and people who worked in this way were seen as difficult or different, both by the organizations and the teams that they worked with, because it was unusual, but also it was difficult from the perspective of the tools that were available. available. The things that we've now all gotten used to in the last 18 months were actually quite rare and unusual and weren't well supported in organizations or even by the tool makers themselves because they were quite rare in terms of their application. So overall, it was seen as unfavorable in the sense that it didn't support collaboration. How am I going to, bounce my new ideas off you if I can't just walk over to your desk or run into you at the coffee machine? There were concerns from a supervision perspective, and this was mostly rooted in trust. If you're not working in a place that I can see you, how do I know that you are actually working? How can I oversee what you're doing if you're not right there? And it was also seen as a bit of a slippery slope. If one person wants to work remotely and we support that, then everyone will want to do that. And again, because that was different and difficult to support, it was not viewed very favorably. And I know some people prior to the pandemic were able to work in a remote or hybrid way. Even within my own team, we did support people working occasionally in a remote way, but that was seen as an exception rather than the rule. And anyone who wanted to work in a remote way was viewed somewhat unusually or even suspiciously because it was something that was unusual for us. So part behind all of this, though, there are some myths and some realities about remote or hybrid working that were affecting the way that people viewed hybrid or remote working. And when we think about employers or supervisors or institutions, some of these were included things like, well, if we let people work remotely, maybe we will save money. We won't have to rent as much office space, so we'll be able to save a little bit of money there. We might even be able to pay people less because they don't have to commute, and so that wouldn't be a factor in terms of compensation. But the reality of a hybrid working model is that you still do have to have some on-site spaces for people. A hybrid organization, as we mentioned, involves people working on-site and remotely and a blend of the two. And so there does still need to be a home office or a central place for people to work. So you don't realize as much in terms of savings as you might think. And there are also some additional costs associated with supporting people working remotely. You do have to have expanded security and network access. You might actually need duplicate tech for people because they need something on site and something at home. And so there isn't necessarily the savings that would be there. There was also this concern about the loss of trust or control over the people that were working. And I put a question beside that because I don't know that that was the reality for people who were working in a remote or hybrid model. Did their supervisors really have less control over them? Would they really lose that control if people were working remotely? We never really tested that in a pre-pandemic world. It was just the perception of the way that people would be working. When it comes to employees, the people who would be working and living in this remote or hybrid situation, there again is this perception about saving money. I'm not going to have to commute. I might be able to live in a place where property is cheaper, so I can have a bigger space or a bigger house. But the reality is that hybrid work, because it involves being both remote and on-site, still requires some level of commuting. There's just less of it. And by extension, you lose some things like what I would call bulk purchasing. If you're only going to come into the office once a week, for example, you may not have a monthly parking pass, but then your daily cost for parking when you are there is going to be much greater than it would be on average with a pass. Similarly with transit, you're not going to buy a monthly pass if you're only going to travel 4 times a week, but then you're going to pay full price for transit. So some math would be required there to see, are you actually saving or are you just shifting where that money is being spent? And the reality that employers might pay less because you are having the privilege of working remotely. So your overall net income might go down because of that. And you still have some of those costs that you have to incur at home. So the perceptions about the money element of working in a hybrid way still had some holes in them and weren't able to really be tested because they weren't being done en masse or in a controlled way. And then there was also the perception for employees that they would have better work-life balance. If they're able to work remotely or in a hybrid way, they're able to set their own schedule and have more control over what they're doing with their time. And so there would be a greater work-life balance there. And the reality of that is, as we will see in the lessons learned, is maybe that's true, but it also might have again, not a better work-life balance, but a shifted work-life balance. And it would be up to the individual to determine whether that was better or not for them. So I'm going to be telling you about my own organization's experience in the transition that we went through 597 days ago when we made the decision in our department to shift our workforce from almost entirely on site to people working off-site or remotely for anyone whose role supported them doing that. So lab staff obviously couldn't be moved to an off-site working environment, but anyone whose job was primarily sitting at a desk or working in the office was something that we could consider. So prior to the pandemic on March 15th of 2020. For myself, I have had a team of about 50 people. I had 7 direct reports, and then for each of them, they also had people reporting to them. So my direct and indirect reports represented 50 people, and 100% of those people worked on site all the time at 2 different locations where our facilities are, but everybody was working on site. And 100% of the people that we supported and worked with, our clients and our collaborators, were at the same location. So everybody was in one, or in our case, two spots. Our 2 locations are 4 blocks apart, so they are essentially in the same neighborhood, and we can consider them as one. We did offer occasional remote work opportunities if somebody needed to focus on writing a report and just needed to spend a day focused on doing nothing but that. People could ask for and receive permission to work remotely for that day or for that period. And we tried to be as flexible as possible with that, but it wasn't something that was encouraged or supported in any sort of formalized way. And as I said, this was the same across our entire department. We have 320 personnel in the department, and we have a lot of lab activities, but we also have a lot of data analysis and data management activities that we do, things that are mostly computer or network based. So on March 16th last year, it was clear that there were things that were going to need to be changed. And so we acted on that Monday to start making the changes to the group. So just to give you an idea of what this looked like organizationally, this is what my team of 50 people looked like 598 days ago. You can see that 100% of these people worked on site. And by the time we got to the Friday of that week, so 5 days after we made that decision, nearly 98% of the team was working in either a remote or a hybrid way. The people that were working in a hybrid were primarily our operations and facilities people and our procurement people, where we needed them to physically be present in order to support the people that were still working on site. So there were things that they needed to do. But even those people whose jobs were primarily on site still worked 3 to 4 days remotely in order to minimize the density and numbers of people that we had on site. So it was quite a rapid and significant transition for our teams. And most of the people that work in my group are management and administration staff, so it was a little bit easier to contemplate how they would make that shift. But this was not inconsistent with what happened in many of our research teams, except for the people whose jobs were primarily lab-based. This is what we did for most of our staff. So as I said, we went into this on the 16th of March, 2020. And my team, not including myself, of 49 people, 98% were remote or hybrid by the end of that week. 82% were remote and 60% were hybrid, so partially on site. And across our department, nearly 80% of our personnel switched from on site to either remote or hybrid by the following Monday. And that was quite a significant shift for us, where we had people working in the, as you can see in the photo here, this isn't from my lab or office, but it's pretty representative of that. We had people working fairly close together, fairly densely populated computer spaces and offices. And within 7 days, that it looked like this. It looked like it had been abandoned because of the rapid switch that we made. So how did we do that? What are the things that we focused on in order to make that switch happen efficiently and effectively? Our number one priority was safety. Everything that we did in terms of making the change, we were doing because we were driven by safety, but also we wanted to make sure that we were maintaining safety for all of our people. We also tried to focus on maintaining productivity and effectiveness, and that was definitely challenging, but it was something that we needed to maintain a focus on throughout. We put a big emphasis on communication throughout this initiative. And lastly, we maintained openness and transparency as much as possible, recognizing that there was a lot of uncertainty around a lot of things for people, and everything that we could do to give them certainty and confidence about what was happening in the workplace would be helpful for them overall. So when it comes to safety, we had two different groups that we had to think about. There were people that we were moving to the remote or hybrid work. How could we make sure that they were safe? And we also had people who continued to work on site. And if they were working hybrid, they were coming on site occasionally. And so we also needed to make sure that we were taking care of safety there. When it came to the remote or hybrid workplaces, we first of all made sure that we supported people in getting their work from home setups in place. We provided training around ergonomics. As much as possible, we provided support with things like monitors and keyboards, mice for the computers. We couldn't provide computers themselves for security reasons. We weren't able to allow computers to leave our work site and go home, but we were able to provide laptops where that made sense to do that. We also allowed people to come in and take their desk chairs home with them so that they had a comfortable chair to sit in while they were working at home. We also implemented a process of daily check-ins and checkouts. We'd like to think that prior to the pandemic, supervisors were checking in every day with every single one of their direct reports, but I think the reality is that that was not the case, but we made sure that that was happening throughout the pandemic, reminding supervisors and employees to check in at the beginning of the day and check out at the end of the day, not as a check on are you working or are you not, but as a safety check. If somebody didn't check in with their supervisor by noon, the supervisor was to follow up with them and say, is everything okay? And then again, at the end of the day, the supervisor needed to hear from everybody that their workday was finished. And that was partly for safety, but partly also for mental health. Some people were moved from an environment where they were on site with 50 or 60 people every day to where they were at home by themselves all the time. And making sure that we had at least some kind of contact with them twice a day was part of making sure that we were keeping them safe. For the people that were on site or those that came on site, of course, we provided all of the safety materials that were needed. Masks were being provided, hand sanitizer, things for cleaning up desk spaces. All of that was provided everywhere in the workplace. We also arranged for additional cleaning staff. So we had cleaning staff come into the site 3 times a day. Previously, it was once a day or once every couple of days. It became 3 times a day for over a year. We put additional engineering controls in place, things like single direction walking. So if you come into this office space, you have to walk only in this direction. And that was to prevent people from coming face to face and not being able to maintain safe distancing. And we did that in the lab as well, making sure that people could work in the lab and be separated from one another. We put plexiglass dividers in place where that was appropriate. And we also, to reduce the requirement for people to use public transit when they felt it was unsafe, we provided support for parking so that people who had to come on site could drive and park for free for the pandemic period. So all of those were things that we did to support the safety of our workers and our supervisors and all of the people that we were responsible for. Most of these were consistent with what our institution and organization did, but some of these were a little bit above and beyond that because we wanted to make sure that the people that we were responsible for felt safe and supported during this period that was unusual for everybody. When it comes to productivity, we, again, similar to the safety issue, we talked with tools. When it comes to IT, we again sure where we could that provided laptops for remote workers. That we had to put a big emphasis on expanding our IT and networks. We had to expand our virtual private network support. We increased that capacity by more than 400% in the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, and it was subsequently doubled over the next few months. That was in order to support people working remotely to be able to come into the network from home or from wherever they were working and be able to simulate what it would be like if they were sitting at their desks. And because we hadn't been enabling that previously, to move a significant portion of our workforce off-site required us to do some quick work with our networks and systems. And we also had to all learn, as everybody did, to adopt additional tools for interactions. And this included Zoom. We went with Zoom as our primary tool because it was one that a lot of other people were using, but it also was one that offered a lot of training and ease of access for a large number of people. It didn't require special software like some other tools might require, and it was easy and affordable for us to adopt. We implemented something called Rocket Chat, which is an internal chat kind of system on our network. It's very similar to Slack, but we also let teams use whatever tools they wanted to use. Some people used Slack, some people used, there was one called Discuss that teams used as a way of staying connected. And we didn't limit the choices that people had for that. If a team wanted to use a particular tool, Google Chat was another one that was used very frequently. We encouraged and supported them in doing that so that they could stay connected. When it comes to other elements of productivity, we had to look at the structure that we provided for people in terms of their supervision and the way we were organized as a group. And we realized very quickly that we had to be flexible about that. We had to change some of our thinking around the amount and type of supervision that people were having, as well as the rules around things like standard working hours. We used to consider that our standard or office hours for our employees were between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., that no matter when you were working, you had to be working during those hours. Well, that was no longer appropriate in this hybrid or remote working world because of the other demands that people were experiencing outside of work. So we had to get rid of a lot of those rules, and a lot of what we brought in were not rules so much as guidelines and recommendations and suggestions for supervisors and employees on how they might want to structure their teams. We just asked that people were consistent with how they were applying those, and we gave them lots of suggestions and guidance on things that might work and lessons that were learned elsewhere. And wherever possible, if we could accommodate it, find ways to make it easier for people to work. So if there was a way that we could accommodate someone's request for their schedule or for the way in which they were working, even people who were working remotely but were really struggling with that, was there a way that we could accommodate them coming back into the workplace? As long as we could do that safely, it was something that we supported doing. And so some people did migrate back to the work site much more quickly than others. The caveat that we had to make sure people understood there was, if you're coming back to work, you want to come back into the work site because you miss the social aspect of being in the workplace, that's not what you're going to find. If you come back into the workplace and you're the only person in that space, you're not going to achieve that social element that you thought. And because of the requirements for masks and distancing, et cetera, some of those social elements were not going to be there anymore. So we needed to make sure that people were accommodated, but also that it was realistic what their expectations could be around that. A big emphasis for us in managing all of this was communication. And we're going to talk about communication in the next session in this series. But for me, as the Director of Management and Administration, it was my job to make sure that people had the information that they needed, that they were supported with active and clear communication. And so I had to apply these principles with a lot of the communications that I was having with our workforce. So I started with the clear, concise, and complete principles. Everything that I was communicating, I needed to make sure that it was easy for people to understand, that there was no ambiguity about the message that I was delivering. I wanted to make sure that it was concise because people were getting bombarded with information from a variety of different sources, some of it reliable, some of it not so reliable. And we needed to make sure that what we gave them was concise, but also complete, that they could rely on it as a source of information to tell them what they needed to know about their workplace. Some of the other C's that came into play, though, around this, we needed to make sure that it was consistent. As I said, it needed to be reliable, but it also needed to be regular. Starting on March 16th, 2020, I sent a daily email to all of our staff in our department. Every day, it was at different times, depending on the information that I had and the urgency around it. But every day, by the end of the day, by about 4 o'clock, people could expect to see an email from me with information that was applicable to them and the work that they were doing. That was ratcheted back a little bit to just 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but we didn't ratchet that back until December of 2020. So every day from March 16th through to December of 2020, everybody got an email from Robyn with information about what was happening. And so it was regular and it was reliable. They knew that they could expect to see that email. When I was away, I made sure that somebody else did it on my behalf. Those communications, which were primarily done by email, had to be comprehensive. So they needed to cover people who were working off-site and remotely in a hybrid way, and the people who were working on site. And it was important that we made sure that everybody was included in the messages that were being delivered. Some information was applicable to everybody, some was only applicable to the people on site or the people working remotely, but we had to make sure that we included them. And we included all personnel, so employees, supervisors and leaders, trainees. We also have non-employees who work within our workspaces. All of them had to be included, as well as new people joining the organization and people who'd been around for a long time. And those communications had to be responsive. So when somebody asked me a question, and one of the things I learned very early on when I was sending a message to all staff, which went to about 350 people in total, I had to put all staff in the BCC box, not in the to box, so that when somebody responded with a question, it didn't go to 350 other people. It just came to me. And that was because we wanted to, again, minimize the variety of channels and conversations that people were having, but also to be respectful of people's questions and concerns that they might not want to share with everybody. But most of the time when somebody asked a question about whether something was applicable or how to navigate a particular problem, there were other people in the workplace who would have a similar question or problem. And so I would take those questions and then address them globally if that was applicable in my next communication with people. I also took the time to make sure that information was curated. There was a lot of information that was coming out from our institutions and organizations that wasn't relevant to our workforce. Information about how the nursing staff needed to interact with patients, for example. None of our employees in our department are nurses, and nobody works directly with patients. So that information was not relevant to them. And so part of my job in communicating was to go through all of the available information, the rules and requirements from our institution, and make sure that what was getting to our staff was the things that are relevant to them. I also had to make sure that people stayed connected. And as I mentioned, we did the check-ins. There was regular reminders from me to all of our employees and leaders and trainees to be checking in with your supervisors, for supervisors to make sure that employees were checking in with them. All of my information went to all staff. And so that was also important. We didn't single out different groups or teams unless that was particularly appropriate. We also started a process of doing prize draws as a way of keeping people engaged. And the prize draws often involved a quiz around, what is one of the ways that we can stay safe in the workplace? What's the name of the new PI that joined our department last month? Things like that to help people stay engaged. We did about 30 of those over the last year or so, and gave out nearly 400 prizes in the course of those draws. So they did a good job of engaging people and keeping them connected. And we also made them fun. What's the TV show that you most enjoyed binge watching during the pandemic, so that other people could learn about those shows and maybe binge watch them the next time they're at home. And of course, we did celebrations whenever there was an opportunity to recognize somebody's success with graduates or new people joining or people retiring. We made a point of singling those out and making sure that people could celebrate those in ways that we couldn't do normally, because we couldn't have a party with cake during this pandemic period. And a big emphasis of what we had in those communications was on maintaining camaraderie and the collaboration that we all like to work on, as well as compassion and empathy for everybody. This was a very difficult time for everybody to go through. There was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change and a lot of disruption, not just to our working worlds, but to our lives. And so as much as we could maintain consistency in the working world, that enabled people to be able to deal with the changes and challenges that they were experiencing elsewhere. So our watchwords throughout all of the communication were an emphasis on teamwork, on kindness, on being calm, being respectful, having empathy for others, and showing gratitude whenever we could. And I mentioned one of the other principles that we had was about being open and transparent. And I really equate this with being honest, acknowledging that there are challenges from March of 2020, even through to today. The pandemic is affecting each person uniquely. Nobody's story is the same as the person next to them. Everybody is experiencing this in a unique way. So the solutions that we put in place, there's no way to make a one size fits all. What we do for the majority is still going to leave some people out, and we need to make sure that we have ways for those people to be accommodated and supported no matter what's going on in the world or their world. Some of the challenges we know happened, people with families suddenly lost access to childcare almost instantly in March of 2020, and that's a very real and important challenge for people. How could we support them? Certainly, we're not in a position to provide childcare to people, but we can do other things to make other elements of their lives easier so that they can come up with the solutions that make sense for them when it comes to all of those other things. When it came to remote learning for kids, suddenly, in addition to losing childcare or teaching, now all of the kids are having to be taught in the home. And some of that is being done remotely, but I know anecdotally there was a greater emphasis and requirement put on parents and people in the home being engaged in the teaching of kids. That meant that people had to have different schedules for their work because part of their day had to be devoted to the teaching for their kids. So being flexible with when people are available and working was an important part of being able to accommodate that, both for accommodating those people, but also those people who, like myself, don't have kids and don't have families that we need to support in that way. But I can still be supportive and empathetic for those people who do have that as an issue. A big part of what we needed to consider was also mental health. This, in addition to being a significant challenge and change for everybody, by changing people's work locations so dramatically and drastically, we were potentially introducing new mental health challenges around anxiety, depression, and even dissociation. And being able to recognize that those things were happening. Also encouraging supervisors and employees to ask for support if they needed or noticed that that was happening, but also to remind people that you're not a mental health expert. Just because you're experiencing something or you've taken a webinar about mental health in the workplace does not make you a mental health expert, but you should be able to recognize and direct people to the supports that they need. And now more than ever, because you are remote from people, you need to be a little bit more attuned to what might be going on. When it came to leading the organization through this, it was important as a part of openness and transparency that when we didn't know something that we said so. If we don't have the answer to a question, we needed to acknowledge that. Don't make it up. Don't think that you know what the answer will be. Just say, we don't have that information right now. People are much more likely to be engaged and supportive of what you are doing if you are acknowledging the things that you don't know and you commit to filling in the blanks when you have that information. But it undermines their trust in us as leaders and organizations if we make stuff up, or we say that we know things when we don't. Or even worse, if we say, yeah, we know the answer to that, but we're not allowed to tell you right now. That's actually terrible. And so we need to make sure that when we don't have the answers for things, we say so. This is all about treating people with respect. People in the workplace are adults, and while they might be struggling with things, we still need to treat them as respectful, autonomous people, and provide them with the information that we have and the supports that we can provide to them. So these were all the driving principles behind what we were doing as an organization. Just going to take a pause and a breath and a sip of water and see if anybody has any questions or comments about that. We're going to explore this a little bit more in just a second, but I want to see if anybody has any questions or comments about our experience as an organization in this transition. This kind of leads into breakout groups. I was going to use the breakout group function in Zoom, but we are a small enough group online today that we can just all be one big breakout group together. So I would encourage you to think about and perhaps open up your mic and talk about, or raise your hand, because now I can see everybody, and just maybe comment on what you found to be your biggest challenge during the transition from working on site to working in a hybrid way. And also, did you experience any positives or trade-offs, things that were better than you expected, or things that were better that you weren't expecting to be better? One thing that hasn't gone away as a result of the pandemic is people being shy about contributing to conversations, and I can understand that. Hopefully, again, we're a small enough group that we can do that. Evelyn, hopefully you can open your mic.
Hey there. I am a new MEOPAR employee. So far my hybrid working has felt really good here, actually, which is nice. But in my previous role, it was definitely a challenge. My workplace was mainly one where folks had to be in the office. So there were a few roles that could not be in the office, which included myself, and it felt really hard to stay connected because there wasn't a lot of communication like that. And most sort of like decisions seemed to be being made by folks who were actually there and not making an effort to include the very few of us who were at home, and we sort of were always playing catch up. So that was definitely a challenge. And I think it was just because people weren't used to thinking about having time to loop people in like that.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly common experience, especially for, as you say, people or organizations where the majority remained on site. Maybe in a way, my organization was, it was a benefit that the vast majority of people moved to be working offsite because we all had to adapt to that. And we're going to talk in a little bit when we look at the lessons learned about that kind of experience, and remembering that in a hybrid workforce, that means everybody is hybrid. If you're working on site 100% of the time, it's not just about you, it's about the whole team. And we have to remember and include and engage people regardless of where they are. Thanks for that. Anybody else? Alexa.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. I can relate to so much of what you're saying, Evelyn. Communication and having that sense of camaraderie and missing those small interactions where information and connection normally would happen and you could just quickly turn to your neighbor or walk over to someone's office and just quickly touch base on something. That was one of the things that most quickly dissipated, and then there started to be a lot of missing information and missing links, and
Yeah.
people weren't being kept in the loop and informed, and it ultimately led to a lot of communication struggles. um, that was one of the biggest challenges. But I think it did prompt folks when they realized, for example, the person I was working most closely with, we were both, feeling these feelings of isolation, and we were able to, be honest with each other and say, okay, how can we adapt? And I think it did force a lot of us into these positions where we had to pivot how we were doing things. And ultimately, it did end up improving our communication after we kind of went through that phase of maybe not doing as great as we could.
Thanks for that, Alexa. Yeah, I know. So one of the things I did, I don't think I covered this in the rest of the presentation, but one of the things I recognized that I was missing, I was one of the few people that stayed on site all the time. And that was primarily just to provide on-site leadership for the people who continued to work on site, even though they didn't report to me. I was the only director level person who remained working on site, and that the feedback I got from the beginning was that was very valuable for the people that were there. We also just needed the practical thing of somebody has to check the mail and somebody has to send, collect the checks and the invoices and make sure that they get to the places that they need to go. And rather than have somebody, I live very close to where our office is. So rather than have somebody have to commute to do that thing, I went to the office every day and worked effectively there. I was able to keep my distance pretty well because everybody else was working from home. But I found what I was missing, and I think other people were missing in their interactions with me, was that sort of serendipitous, passing you in the hallway, or I think I'm just going to ask Robyn a question. I'm going to go to her office and knock on her door, and we can have a chat. And of course, none of that was happening anymore because everybody was away. What I implemented fairly early on was what I called, I created a Zoom meeting on my account that was called Open Door. And whenever I was not in a meeting, my Open Door meeting link was open, and I made sure everyone on my team had that, so they could look at my calendar and see, oh, Robyn's not in a meeting, and they could click on that Zoom link and they could come into my virtual office and we could just have a chat, and maybe there would be other people there and it would be kind of like when they were on site. It didn't work as well as I had hoped that it would work, but it was used a few times by people, and it did give them that opportunity for that little bit of old-fashioned serendipitous interaction. And using tools effectively like that can be a way to sort of mimic or replace some of that. Some of the teams that I worked with did a similar thing. They created a virtual office, and whenever they were at their desks working, if they weren't in a meeting, they had that open so that people could just say, hey, Robyn, do you know where the such and such a thing is? Just like they would if they'd walked over to my desk or come into my office. So trying things like that, but recognizing, the limitations of them is a way that we can try and mimic some of that, but also take advantage of the tools that we have available to us.
I really love that idea of having an open door policy and being able to just pop in and pop out. I think during the pandemic, at the start especially, there was an increase in emails and trying to communicate
Yes.
communicate that way. And I think that was a bit of a negative trade-off. But then you kind of see different ways of communicating kind of coming out of that. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how things will continue to progress in the future.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for all of that discussion. I want to just take a look at my own experience again and the lessons that I learned both as a leader and an employee. It's something perhaps we sometimes forget that people who are supervisors or managers or leaders, they're also employees. They have a boss they report to too, and they're workers. And so their experience is different, but still valid and perhaps challenging. Some of the lessons that I took away from this whole experience, and I say took away, but we're still kind of in it, so there's still lots of things to learn. First of all, that nothing, or at least very little, is impossible. When we say you can't possibly do that, we actually just a lot of times mean we haven't tried, we haven't thought outside the box for a different way of doing it. Within every challenge is an opportunity, which sounds very Sound of Music, Wizard of Oz like, but it's very true, and we'll look at some of those. And lastly, that the pandemic was not an ideal way to test this. It was an experiment by requirement rather than a controlled way of looking at things. And while we can learn some things from it, we have to remember that it was not an ideal way to be doing this. And we shouldn't think that this is the way that we have to do it just because that's the way we've been doing it through the pandemic. So first of all, thinking about things being possible. 2 years ago, if you had said that somebody could come up with an idea for a vaccine, develop it, test it, and get it into the marketplace in 18 months, people would have laughed at you. There's no way. It always takes 7 to 10 years to develop a new drug or a treatment or get it into the market. Well, what we learned in the pandemic is that's totally not true. It's possible to do it, and not just once. There are multiple companies who developed vaccines, who developed treatments, who developed drugs, most of which are in various stages of developments and approvals, but all of them are way farther along in the development and delivery pipeline than they would have been in quote unquote normal circumstances. So that impossible thing became possible in this environment. Another thing in my working world, because I work in a health authority, prior to the pandemic, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, if you needed to talk to a doctor, you had to make an appointment and go to a place and sit in an office and interact one-on-one with a doctor. You couldn't get a prescription refill without making an appointment and going to a doctor's office and getting it physically in your hand. Well, and people said telehealth, so interacting with your doctor by, in a video conference or on the phone or even by email was impossible. There's no way that that's ever going to be the case. Well, that is how healthcare is delivered now in many situations, with the exception of emergencies and interactive tests. You still have to go to a place to give blood for a blood test, but otherwise most things are done virtually. And that's definitely been my own experience. Most of my interactions with my healthcare providers now are done by email or on the phone. We share information. They email me test requisitions that I then take and show on my phone when I go to the lab. So there's a lot of things that have changed and evolved, and all of those tools were in place and available prior to the pandemic. We were just told it was impossible to use them for a variety of reasons, and now we use them pretty regularly. Another thing that seemed to be impossible to get a handle on was other communicable diseases, and influenza is the one that I'm most familiar with. Prior to the pandemic, influenza was something that occurred and was a concern in the health in communities and certainly in healthcare environments every winter. From December 1st through to some mysterious date in the spring, it was flu season, and people were encouraged to be vaccinated and report when they specifically had flu symptoms. Last year, in the first winter of the pandemic, certainly here in British Columbia, there was exactly 0 cases of influenza reported in British Columbia. And that was because of all of the other interventions that were happening to reduce communication of communicable diseases. But to say that it was impossible to restrict or control a communicable disease, actually we put the lie to that when it came to influenza, and perhaps we're on the verge of putting the lie to that when it comes to COVID as well. And so similarly, the idea that you could have a diverse hybrid workforce that is the norm was also something that was seen to be impossible. It'll take a miracle to do that. Only really weird high-tech companies will do that kind of thing. Those are the same companies that used to have ping pong tables in their offices. They're just weird and they're new and it's never going to last. Well, now we're in a world where this is the way that it's likely going to be for the foreseeable future. And so we need to learn the lessons from that. Again, not that we want to keep doing everything that we're doing in the pandemic, but we should take the best of those things and be able to move them forward. So some of the lessons that I will take away from this experience, things that we want to learn from when it comes to thinking about distractions. In the past, as I said, when we used to allow people to occasionally work remotely, the idea was that if I can work from home for a day, there's going to be fewer distractions at home for me, so I can focus on this thing that I need to focus on. And while that's true, there were fewer distractions from your coworkers because nobody knew where you were, so nobody could contact you. There certainly are many other distractions that appear in the home working or remote working environment, and definitely during the pandemic when everybody was doing it. Unless you lived alone, there was probably somebody else in your home space who was also working, which meant that you had some distractions going on. So the challenge really became that there were greater distractions at home than in the workplace. And that was my own personal experience as well, because being the only person in the workspace, I would sometimes go into work and in a space where there were previously 150 people all working together, I was the only person there. So actually greater distractions occurred at home than occurred on the work site. We need to just understand and recognize the balance of what we mean by distraction and what are the ways that we can control that both physically and technologically. The idea of flexibility and balance, thinking about this from the employee's perspective, the opportunity when it comes to this work-life balance, you have greater autonomy when you're working remotely or when you're working in a hybrid way. And hopefully employers and organizations are recognizing that opportunity for autonomy and letting people change things like where they're working, what their schedule is, that kind of thing. And the opportunity to juggle time throughout the day was definitely an opportunity, particularly again for people with families. I know some of my direct reports, the huge opportunity they had or realized during the pandemic was they now didn't have to commute. So they could get up in the morning, they could work for a couple of hours before their families sort of got going. They could take a break in the morning to get people on their way out the door to school or to work if other people were going to work, could focus for a little bit during the day. The family comes home later in the day, and so they focus on that, and then they do a little bit of work in the evening. Overall, the number of hours that they were working was the same. It was just spread out over a much longer period of time. And in fact, they probably were working a little bit more, but that was an acceptable trade-off to them because of the emphasis that they had on the life part of their work-life balance and that autonomy and the ability to make those choices. The challenge that we have to think about with that is when we are given a choice and we have that autonomy about when and how we're going to be working, we now also have the responsibility to be doing that. We have to make those decisions and choices. We have to remember we have a job and there are some requirements around that. And when we say that we're going to be working, we actually have to be working. And so with that choice comes that responsibility to live up to that. If we remember one of the challenges or myths that employers have about a hybrid work environment, not being able to trust people, when we have the choice to create that balance and that adjustment on our schedule, we have to be responsible with how we do that. There's also the challenge of this expectation of always being on because we are working remotely and we can work from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. We have to remember the perception that we're always on can be dangerous and damaging to that work-life balance. One of the things that I did to help manage that for the people that report to me, I started this approach of what I call email mindfulness. And so even if I was working early in the morning or late at night, if I wrote out an email to somebody at 9:30 in the evening, I didn't send it to them then. I put it in my draft folder, and then the next morning when the regular workday started, that's when I sent it to them. And that was so that I was not projecting onto them the expectation that I'm working at 9:30 at night, so should you. And it was the same thing in the early mornings, on vacation days, or on weekends. If it's not urgent, then it can wait until Monday. And so I can work if I choose to. That's part of my autonomy and my balance with my work and my life, but I shouldn't be projecting that onto other people. But there was also the challenge of people working longer hours because they had this autonomy. They sometimes felt that they owed their employer, well, if I have this flexibility, I should work 10 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day in order to sort of pay back that. And the difficulty there is the impact on mental health, and then creating that expectation that you're always on. So we need to make sure that we're giving people that flexibility, but also some boundaries around their work so that they can maintain that work-life balance. We actually did a survey of our employees in early on in the pandemic. I think it was in July of 2020, and we asked them, one of the questions was, did you agree with these statements? And one of the statements was, I have better work-life balance now that I'm working remotely. And 85% of the respondents said yes to that, that they strongly agreed with that statement. And that was because of the autonomy that they had with their schedule. Again, one of the myths that we talked about earlier was about the costs, and thinking specifically about costs to employees or workers. Certainly there's opportunities with lowering our costs due to commuting or parking. We don't have to spend as much on clothes because we only really have to dress from the waist up now when we're working at home. I can tell you that I wear jeans the vast majority of the time now, and I can't remember the last time I wore high heel shoes. And that's because I don't need to anymore. I can be as tall as I want to be in front of my camera. But that means there's some savings there around that. There are some lower costs associated with food, even as I think most people, even though they might say, I pack and bring my lunch to work all the time, most people, at least some of the time, go out and buy a coffee or go out and grab their lunch. That's not happening anymore when we're working at home. So we have some cost savings there. And there could even be some cost savings when it comes to childcare if we're not able to, or we're not required to have childcare costs as a part of our work because we are home more frequently, then that can result in lower costs. But there are also some additional costs that when we're working remotely, we have to take into consideration. We do have to set up our home office and designate that space. As nice as it might be to sit on your couch and work, you can't do that all day, every day. So you do need to have a space to be able to work and work well. And there's some individual costs associated with that. There's some tax benefits, but they definitely do not offset all of the costs for our personal choices and preferences with our home office. And the employer at some point isn't obligated to completely outfit you in your home office space. So there'll be some costs there. And for a lot of people who didn't work at home at all before, there were definitely some increased costs when it comes to the internet. You couldn't just use your basic low-level internet plan anymore if you were needing to VPN into your office every day. And if a lot of people were now working in the same space, we needed to make sure that the Wi-Fi support within our homes or our remote locations was sufficient to allow for all of those people who are going to be using it. And so that, again, represented some additional costs. Those additional costs are pretty much one time, whereas the opportunity for lowering our costs are things that happen on an ongoing basis. And each individual would need to evaluate what the pros and cons of those things are. But these are things to think about when it comes to having a remote or a hybrid setup on an ongoing basis. One of the other myths we talked about, or the challenges that can be seen, was the challenge of supervision and supervisor's perspective that I can't see you, so I don't know what you're doing. That's to me, that's a real myth. If supervisors and employees were having challenges in terms of that trust between them, in terms of what the employee was doing, whether or not the employee was being effective in doing the things that they were supposed to do, generally, and in my experience, was talking to supervisors, where that became an issue in a remote working environment, that was actually an issue before. The remote working exacerbated it because now there was another barrier between the supervisor and the employee, but it didn't cause that situation to occur. And it's important for supervisors to remember that. If we're having doubts about what an employee is working on, would that be the case regardless? And if the answer is yes, which it usually is, then remote working is not causing the problem. It's just introducing an additional challenge that is surmountable with other tools and approaches that we can make. So supervisors would really need to ask themselves, what is the reality of that problem? At the same time, when we talk about employees having that autonomy, supervisors also have the autonomy as well to change the ways in which they work with people to make sure that that's supported. And as employees, if we now have that greater autonomy, we need to demonstrate that we can be trusted. And as I said before, when it comes to that schedule and when we're available, if we say that we are online and working, then we actually need to be online and working. So we shouldn't violate that trust, which is the same trust that we get when we used to go into the workplace. We shouldn't be spending our time in the workplace on our computers streaming Netflix. And we also shouldn't be doing that when we're at home either. So it's the same kind of issue. The remote work introduces another facet to that, but it doesn't cause problems in the way that sometimes people perceive. Another element to think about is what we might refer to as equity. It's certainly the challenge when it comes to remote or hybrid working is that it doesn't work for all roles. As I said, we had a lot of staff members who work in a laboratory environment. They can't take the DNA sequencer home with them. They can't take samples home with them. They have to come into the lab and do that work. And so it isn't an approach that can be applied to everyone. And part of the way that we address that is by not forgetting some people are on site and some people are at home. As some of you mentioned during the breakout discussion, we have to remember that everybody is now working in a different way, and that includes the people that are working on site as well as the people that are working remotely. And certainly there are mental health challenges that can be both introduced and exacerbated by creating this new environment, and particularly if people are now required to work remotely for some reason, we might be exacerbating or augmenting or even creating in some situations a mental health challenge because of that separation and that isolation. And it's important that we recognize and acknowledge that. We can't fix it necessarily by just allowing everybody to come back, but if we recognize that it's there and provide access to information and supports, we'll be doing what we can to address that. But on the other side of equity, the opportunity to work remotely or in a hybrid way works in a variety of different roles, regardless of the hierarchy where you are in the organization. So I showed you earlier our organization chart for my team, and we have entry-level people working in admin support roles, and we had director level and senior manager level people, and everyone was given the opportunity, and in many cases the requirement for the pandemic, to be able to work remotely. And that's something that we need to recognize to continue. As well, there are opportunities when it comes to mental health. And what I mean by this is that prior to the pandemic, we might have thought that everybody was thriving and working perfectly well in an on-site workspace. And that is no more true than saying everybody is working and thriving when working remotely. Everybody will respond to and deal with their work environment in different ways. Some people thrive in an on-site social dense work environment because they are stimulated by those interactions with other people. But there also will be people who thrive in a remote working environment because they need the quiet to be able to focus. They actually find those social interactions stressful or demanding in ways that challenge their own mental health. And so we need to recognize that there's no one size fits all. Some people thrive in one environment, some people thrive in another environment, and it's not appropriate to say everybody just needs to come back to work because that's the way we all work best. That's totally not true. Just one other thing I would want to mention about this, and it's again a challenge from a supervisor and manager perspective. When I was talking with some supervisors in this past summer, we were asked to more formally implement a flexible work location program. And I had some interactions with managers who said, well, we don't want to implement something like this more formally or on an ongoing basis because everyone will just want to take Mondays and Fridays off. And I had to correct people several times to say, people who are working remotely are not taking time off. They are just choosing to work in a different schedule because that's what makes sense for them. And every time you refer to somebody working remotely as being off, you are assuming that they're skiving off and not doing the things that they're supposed to do. And you're perpetuating that lack of trust with people. So we need to manage how we refer to this as people working remotely, not people off when they're working remotely. And that was a struggle for some supervisors to sort of get their heads around. But again, it was this, I can't see you. And so if I can't see you working, you must not be working. When that was clearly demonstrated throughout the pandemic that that was not the case, people were working well and effectively and very productively. So how would we compare the perceptions of the remote hybrid work pre-pandemic versus during and hopefully post-pandemic? Where something that was rare became very common. And as I said, wasn't done in an ideal way. We made this switch for a large number of people very quickly. It was previously seen as a privilege, and during the pandemic, it was a requirement. People could not work safely on site because of the concerns and conditions around the communicable disease. So it became a requirement. That's not, again, necessarily an ideal way to do it, to require people to work in a remote or hybrid way, but that's where we are now and likely will be for a while more. It was not very well supported previously. Again, it was seen as difficult, and certainly the tools were also challenging, but now it is desirable for many people to do it. So it's not seen as difficult, as I said, it's seen as required. But we also have implemented new structures and ways of working, and new tools are in place. Everybody knows how to use Zoom now, whereas 2 years ago, probably very few people knew how to use it. And a lot of other tools have come into place which support and enable it. And when it comes to all of those unfavorable things about the lack of collaboration, the lack of supervision and trust, and the idea that, well, everyone will want to do it, and if they're everybody's working from home on Fridays, then they're not working. Those things are not the reality. It's not that remote or hybrid working is bad. It's just different than what we were used to, as 2 years ago. And it will continue to change and evolve as we move through the pandemic into a post-pandemic world. So thinking about all of that and your own experiences when it comes to the pandemic, just another poll for people who are with us. Going forward, how would you prefer your work to be? 100% on-site, 100% remote, or a bit of both? Interesting. Since the majority of us were working on-site pre-pandemic, 0% of you want to return to that world. So that's, I think, quite revealing of the things that we learned through this. As difficult as it's been, there are definitely some positives that we have now. Great. Alexa, I see your hand is up.
I'm not able to answer the poll as one of the co-hosts, but it's funny because at the start of the working with MEOPAR and we opened up the office again, I thought I was going to come in every day and it was going to make my work-life balance so much better. And in getting into it, I realized that, I thought I had missed coming in every day. And when you get back into the flow, you realize that there are so many benefits of that hybrid, like you're suggesting. It was just interesting to see how that changed after getting back to what I thought was normal.
Yeah, there's that a song or saying, you don't know what you have until it's gone. And when you start to make that change, you think, oh, I'm going to run back into the office every day. Oh, but yeah, it was actually really convenient to be able to just go into the kitchen and make my lunch or grab a coffee, or not have to remember my access card every time I need to go to the bathroom. Those kinds of things suddenly become, they're minor, but they're impediments to the flow of your day. I know that was our experience as well. When we started over the summer, we started to relax some of our on-site restrictions. It was still controlled, but we offered people the opportunity, if you really would prefer to come on site, just get the approval of your supervisor and talk to our operations people so that we know who's around, because we still had to control density. But if we can make it work for you, we will do that. And several people put their hand up. Oh yeah, I want to come back in. I want to start coming back in on Monday, and I'm going to be there every day. And I can tell you, as the person who's on site every day, that lasted for some people for about 2 days. And then they were like, actually, I don't want to be here every day. It wasn't the, the rose garden that they remembered it being, especially because there were so few other people around. But also they missed some of the things about working at home, like the creature comforts of being in your own space. So that option of being able to go when you wanted to, when it made sense for you, that autonomy of being able to choose that suddenly became more appropriate. And that's where I think we're really going to get to in that future world. I really think from a workplace perspective, the future is hybrid. Every workplace. Now, again, with the exception of work that requires access to a specific facility or materials or tools, for the most part, the future is going to be hybrid, with everybody working sometimes on site, sometimes remotely. And so needing the support in both of those places, but also having the autonomy and the responsibility to establish a way of working that that allows that to happen. And then the workplaces, the people who are on site, if everybody's working in a hybrid way, then those circumstances that we discussed earlier, where everybody's on site and one person's working remotely, and so we forget about that person who's working at home, if everybody's now doing a blend, that kind of thing will become less and less common, because everybody will be in that same situation. And tools that we've learned how to use over the last year and a half are now ubiquitous, and so will become very common for us to be using all the time. What's most important to take away from this experiment that we're living through in the pandemic hybrid working world is to pay attention to what's going on and learn from those experiences, and recognize, remember the things that were once impossible are now possible. The same is true for the things that we're learning now. The way that we are working now and the tools that we're using, those don't have to be the tools that we keep using forever. We should be able to learn from those and adapt and apply new things going forward, and recognize that while it's difficult to change, it's not impossible to change. And the ways in which we're working don't have to stay that way forever. They should adapt and respond to the working world and the requirements. So of course, change the things that aren't working. Don't use tools that aren't supporting you, but share the things that do work. If you find a tool that's working for you, or a way in which you are working, find ways to share that with others, and don't make them learn the lessons the hard way. If you have a tool that's working, share that with other people. When it comes to leading through organizations in a hybrid way, these principles that we adopted for our group are things that we should always have, but it became reinforced as things that we need to keep top of mind. Good communication, not just lots of communication, good communication. So thinking about being consistent, being reliable, being curated and applicable to people, and inclusive of all of the people in the organization. Being transparent and honest. If you don't have the information about something, say so. Being trusting and trustworthy, and being respectful. And this last point, recognizing that not everyone thrives in a remote or hybrid environment, but not everyone was thriving in the old world either. And so the opportunity that we can take away from this experience is to recognize that everyone needs an environment that enables them to be supportive and effective, and respected. And the way in which we do that is we learn from these lessons to take them forward. And that's really what I want to leave us with today. The lessons learned that I hope you got from this session, but also from some of your own experiences, is that the pandemic experience was really an experiment, not a controlled one necessarily, and certainly not one that we designed, but it was an experiment and not a situation that we want to perpetuate. We need to learn from that experience and take those lessons forward to create create a hybrid world that works for everyone. And that involves flexibility as well as structure, and balancing the costs and benefits of a hybrid world with the work-life balance that individuals need to have. We all have roles to play in that to make it work. Employers have roles to play to set the guidelines and the requirements for things and allow for that flexibility. Supervisors have roles to play to make sure that people are well supported, and employees and personnel within that workspace all have roles to play to be trusted and trustworthy, and to make sure that we're applying the tools that make sense for us and for our colleagues. Just remember, it's not harder than it used to be. It's just different than what it used to be. And we need to find ways to take the lessons learned, the positive things forward. And lastly, that when we have those options, that flexibility and that autonomy, that means we also have the responsibility to apply that well to our work and be consistent and reliable and respectful when we do that. So with that, I will come to an end. Thank you very much for your time and attention and for your engagement in the discussion. We've got a few minutes left if you'd like to have some further discussion or questions about this or about anything. This is an Ask Me Anything time.
I have a question for you,
Yes.
Robyn. So apologies if you covered this and I might have missed it.
It's okay.
But I'm curious how you and your workplace kind of came up with the policies and adjustments that you created for your workforce at the beginning of the pandemic. Like, were you looking at what other companies were doing? Did you have a task team, or how did you kind of make those decisions initially?
Good question. It was a bit of a blend of things. Certainly, being a part of a large institution, our department is within an institution known as BC Cancer, which is a part of a larger health authority, the Provincial Health Services Authority. And at all of those levels, at the PHSA level, at the BC Cancer level, at the BC Cancer Research level, there were new rules and requirements and guidelines coming in from all of these different places. And as you can imagine, if you've ever worked for a large institution, a lot of times those are conflicting. One level says this, another level says that, a third level says something different. What we did right from the very beginning, and we started this on the Saturday before March 16th, myself and the other directors and some of our senior managers had some conversations about what we thought made the most sense for our department. And we respected and acknowledged the guidelines and requirements that were coming from our larger institutions. But again, there were some conflicts and there were some gaps in those. And we looked at what made sense for our workforce. Nobody knows our team and workforce better than we do. And so we needed to take some responsibility for that by putting those things in place. We took what we could confirm from those other institutional requirements. We made sure that those were in place, and then we filled in the gaps as best we could. But we also were not static about that. The rules and requirements that we put in place in that week in March, they changed the following week, and then they were adapted a little bit more the week after that. And so being nimble and flexible was a requirement for us in terms of establishing those rules and then providing that flexibility and support to everyone. And where we couldn't, as I said, where we had gaps, where we didn't know something, it's not that we made it up, but we made the best decision that we could with the information that we had, and we let people know. We don't know the answer to that. This is what we recommend you do in that situation, but we're going to try and get further guidance for you from the organization. And that loop of communication was consistent throughout.
Thank you. I appreciate the insights.
Yeah, no problem.
I really liked your concept of email mindfulness and knowing when to send your emails at the right time. Guilty as charged. I definitely have not adopted that practice yet. I'm slowly getting better. But one of the biggest challenges, I think, is knowing when teammates are on and when is the best time to send those emails. And so I'm curious about your approach to the daily check-ins and checkouts and
Yeah.
how you approach that. And
Yeah, so every supervisor did it differently, and again, we let them do that. As I said, some teams used like a chat channel, like a Google Chat or a Slack channel or something like that. And so they would create a team site, and everybody would, when they started their work day, Robyn checking in would go out to everybody, so everybody would see, okay, Robyn's online. And over the course of time, you got to be very familiar with what people's typical days were in terms of when they were on and when they were not. For me, specifically for my direct reports, I asked them to email me at the beginning. They could use text if they wanted to, but we didn't use a channel of any kind. I asked them to email me just because that was the tool that I was most familiar with and where I could know that I was going to hear from them. And so, and I kept on my phone, I kept a list of all of my direct reports. I had 9 people reporting to me throughout the pandemic. And so every morning I would just have that list and I would check off when they checked in. And then later on in the day, I would uncheck them for when they checked out. If it got to be 9 o'clock and someone still hadn't checked out, I would just send them a quick text message or an email and say, hey, are you still working or are you done for the day? Most of the time it was like, oh, sorry, I forgot to check out. But it reinforced to them the importance of doing that check-in, and it demonstrated to them that I was paying attention, that I was concerned about what they were doing and where they were, and that they were okay. And that just became a routine for everybody throughout the pandemic. And that's the approach that I used, was just have that check-in and check out. With the time, it was variable. Some people who I know when they worked on site, typically arrived in the office between 9 and 9:30, and that's when I could expect to see them. Suddenly those people were checking in with me, doing their first email at 7 o'clock in the morning. And that's because they'd shifted the times in which they were working. They didn't have to drive from very far away into Vancouver. And so they could work those early hours in the morning. We could get some stuff done, maybe that we would have had to wait until later in the day. And so it was variable, but it was learning about people. And I think that's one of the things that I've taken away from this whole experience, is getting to know the individuals that I work with. I thought I was pretty good at that before, but this actually taught me that, yeah, there's still some things to learn about each of those people, and they all work differently. And if I'm going to support them well, I have to learn and understand that. Certainly as a supervisor, I'm allowed to say, you have to do it this way. But you have to use that judiciously and do it in a way that supports the work that people are doing. Hopefully that kind of addressed your question. It's a big, it depends. All right.
Robyn, I just wanted to say thank you. This was really great.
Echoing Bridget and Catherine in the chat, thank you so much for delivering this presentation today on the hybrid model of remote work. If you enjoyed Robyn's presentation, we have another session coming up at 2 p.m. Atlantic time, 10 a.m. Pacific time,
That's right.
on virtual communication basics, which I am very much looking forward to. So thank you again, and we will see you soon.